So Richard, are we all set?
We're all set. Hello, Fresh. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Should I try and share my screen with you?
Let me just introduce the work that you're doing, and then I'll just hand over. You can actually, I'll make you the host, and then you can drive this whole conversation forward. Yeah?
Great.
Okay. So next up, we have Richard Macgeorge. Richard is going to be presenting underrepresentation of futures approaches in infrastructure strategy making. I think something he believes that infrastructure supports human well-being and is so highly consumptive. He has written a paper and has explored how many of these foresight and futures approaches are underrepresented in infrastructure and strategy. Richard himself is an infrastructure financial advisor since 1980s, starting out in Morgan Grenfell in London and on its Soviet and Eastern European desk. Through the 90s, was part of the project finance team of HSBC Investment Bank in London, Hong Kong, and Thailand. Richard, over to you. I think you're the best person to be taking us through why is foresight and futures thinking missing in infrastructure development?
Thank you, Paresh. And I note that I am trying to click on share screen, and I'll get the administration out of the way first. Host disabled participants.
I have just assigned you the host.
There we are. Modern technology.
Over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to check to see whether you can see that on your screen. The first page.
Yes, we see that.
Great. Okay. Let me just work out how I'm going to. There we are. Okay. Thank you very much for asking me to speak and for accepting my abstract for the presentation. It's a great opportunity, really, for me to be able to share my work, which is part of a PhD I'm doing at the University of the Sunshine Coast. And the focus for me really has emerged out of something of an epiphany that I had in 2010, 2011. And it started here in the city of Christchurch, New Zealand, which is my hometown. Very early one morning on the 4th of September 2010, I was away on an international development assignment internationally, and I've spent the last 30 years working in international development and particularly in infrastructure and infrastructure financing. One of the things about infrastructure is it touches everything, it touches every aspect of life, and we tend to look at infrastructure as some sort of inert item that sits there, but I think hopefully through this talk we'll see that it has much more deeper meaning for civilization and vice versa. But on this morning in Christchurch in New Zealand, and Christchurch was a city that never really experienced earthquakes of any note, a 7.1 earthquake struck. What was notable about it was that it had some of the highest ground force accelerations, both vertically and horizontally, ever recorded in the world. The impact was a number of people died, 185 people died, but in addition to that, there was also substantial injury and psychological injury to people that went on for some years and in some ways continues. 3/4 of the city had to be demolished in terms of the central city and the central city buildings. We called it the Donut City. 650,000 claims were made for residential claims, including my house, which was a write-off. And it turned out to be the 4th most expensive insurance event globally at the time. And you'll see here on the screen that the impact on infrastructure was really very significant as well. 1,000 kilometres of roads needed to be repaired or replaced, wastewater 500 kilometres, and around 100 kilometres of water pipes. What was most interesting, though, was that all of a sudden the residents of Christchurch became citizens, and they were really very interested in the future of the city, and they were very interested in the future of civilization. Now, I applied for and was accepted as the general manager for the government earthquake recovery authority that was established. And Before taking up that appointment, I was racking my brain about the relationship between infrastructure and human wellbeing. And I noted that there were only 4 papers that mentioned, academic papers that mentioned wellbeing and infrastructure in the title of the paper. It seemed to me to be a really under-researched area. And so from that, I was talking to a friend one night, and she mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it dawned on me that there was a relationship between Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we see on the left-hand side of the triangle on the screen, and infrastructure, that there was also an infrastructure or a built hierarchy of needs, that for each need, there were services provided by different types of infrastructure. So we can see at the bottom, for example, physiological needs are met by physiological buildings, for example, water and waste, electricity, and so forth. And then at the next level, security needs. And each of these services are provided at different levels of the hierarchy as well. They have a home level, and then they move up the Maslow hierarchy. And then if we look at security needs, for example, we can see that we have defence, we have police, the judiciary, and so forth. Belonging needs, we have community buildings, faith buildings, and so forth. And then further up, we have educational, higher education, and then cultural infrastructures. So each of these relate to some sort of need. My focus at the time was really focused on the relationship with well-being. In the 10 years that have emerged since, we've seen much more interest in the climate crisis, and I've spent more time considering the relationship between climate, resources, infrastructure, and human well-being. So what I'm working on at the moment is a method for how we might be able to intermediate these things. I started by doing an environment scan using Sahel and Ayatollah's futures triangle approach under his 6 pillars method. And I'm not going to spend so much time on this slide. I'm going to break it down and give you a sense of the things that emerged out of that analysis for me and where it's taken me so far in the research. Okay, so if we look at the wave of history, what's really interesting is that infrastructure involves deep time. And if we cast back and we start thinking about the role of infrastructure planning and where infrastructure planning emerged from, we go right back to the Neolithic period. And in the Neolithic period, what was significant, of course, during this Neolithic revolution was the establishment of surplus. And in the establishment of surplus, there became a need to plan for how surplus would be spent. And much of that surplus was spent for early infrastructure. Roads for connecting settlements, irrigation, and so forth, largely in Samaria and Uruk and in the Middle East. That surplus enabled settlements, and settlements engendered population growth. Population growth required a degree of consumption and material extraction in order to support that growth. And in the last 12,000 years, what we've seen is that there has emerged this extraction growth paradigm. And the extraction growth paradigm relies on us drawing resources from the earth. Half of what we consume is mined and half is farmed. And we use those to consume for our well-being, for humankind, for the furtherance of civilization. So we're caught in this extraction growth paradigm. And that's emerged over the last 12,000 years. And of course, we're so entrenched in that paradigm that that's the paradigm that's cast for us now. And is that a problem for us? Well, if we look at the next slide, we can see that it really is a problem. Because the big drivers for this material consumption is really around population, and that's at 2 levels: population growth and also increasing want per person. You'll see on this chart that the line at the bottom, population, we can see since 2000 continues to expand. So we know the population story very well. So there are 2 of these drivers that are driving our consumption. Now, if we look at the other lines, the brown line is GDP, which we're now increasingly seeing as a flawed mechanism for marking economic growth because it encourages consumption maximization. And then our material footprint, which is really our consumption. And then above that, a most interesting line, which is gross capital formation. Now, gross capital formation is a measure that really calculates all the things that we make with the stuff that we extract. And we can see that the relationship between population growth and gross capital formation and material flows, there is that relationship, but we can see that material flows are also increasing. There is a third element that's driving our material flows and our consumption and ultimately our gross capital formation. And that is really coming from what I call neo-fortification. So we've always fortified ourselves, from castles through to current day. And the fortifications that are occurring now are really in the relationship between, we can see primarily the trade relationship and the relationship of power between China and the US playing out. We can see the climate crisis, and so we're fortifying under the name of resilience against the climate crisis. COVID, a pandemic, we're vaccinating, we're fortifying against pandemic. And then periodically, we have these economic financial crashes. We had the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. We had the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and we're facing the potential for a further economic crisis. What happens each time we have a crisis is that there is more fiscal expenditure. Governments put more into the economy. At the moment, governments across the world are putting in 15% more above their normal budgets into COVID response. Now, what does that go towards? It goes towards further consumption. So if we spend our time looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and how well we're going, and we then compare that to gross capital formation, much of which is infrastructure in the built environment, we can see that we're actually doing worse rather than better. And so this, to me, is a sobering chart that tells us that we must do something fundamentally and radically different in relation to our infrastructure planning and strategy. The problem, though, is that our infrastructure planners and strategists, and I count myself in that number, so I don't mean to be unduly critical, adopting and have adopted since Neolithic times essentially the same approach to infrastructure. We have these very entrenched approaches. And yet uncertainty is increasing. And so if we look at the World Uncertainty Index created by a couple of IMF economists, we can see that uncertainty is increasing. Uncertainty and long-term infrastructure don't go very well together. And so we're trying, in the face of this uncertainty, to plan and to strategize for the long term for infrastructure, which, as much as anything, is about strategizing for what civilization might look like, or the range of possibilities for what civilization might look like going forward, and how we interpret that for infrastructure. But what we're doing instead is we're really focusing on this notion of evidence-based decision-making. Political masters are looking for evidence. Well, there isn't evidence for the future. Those facts don't exist, as Wendell Bell tells us. And so taking the past and projecting and conjuring up a new reality based on the past is working less and less well. And so what we're seeing is that the use of futures and foresight approaches are really not being well adopted across the world. And the table on the right shows you a sea of red, the lack of foresight being mentioned in key infrastructure strategy documents, and the reliance on evidence basing. So we've got a challenge, and I wonder where that takes us. To me, if we look at this chart on the right, we can see that infrastructure really is a process of converting resources, the four capital stocks, if you like, and particularly nature, into physical infrastructure that is operated to provide services. And those services are really for human well-being. And so we've got two elements astride to this infrastructure machine. On one side, we've got nature, and on the other side, we've got human well-being. Humans are very good at negotiating for themselves their outcomes, but there isn't a voice on the other side. And so my question is whether there is a need for there to be other actors, another actor in the conversation. What type of conversation can nature and humankind have together so that we can interpret infrastructure needs that are balanced and consequently think about the services that civilization might need going forward? I wonder, and this is the area where I'm researching now, is whether it is possible for nature and humankind to enter into some form of negotiation. At the moment, the negotiation is that humans, we decide, usually through environmental legislation, for nature, but nature doesn't have its own voice. Now, if we look on the left, there are a couple of examples that I find quite interesting that I want to explore in my next paper, and I want to share this with you now. So in New Zealand and in India, there are a couple of very interesting developments. In New Zealand, what was formerly known as the Urewera National Park was given its own legal personality, and its legal personality was created by Act of Parliament. The same has occurred with an area called the Wanganui River. And these two areas of environment have been given their own legal personalities, intermediated or interpreted by stewards who are a combination of Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, and also the Crown, representing all New Zealanders. So this is an early mechanism, and of course in India, the Ganges River or parts of the Ganges River have also been given their own legal personality. This is an area I want to explore further. Is this a mechanism? Are these weak signals for how our environment might be able to have a voice? And if so, what does it have a voice over? I'm really interested in Nivonen's lifestyle backcasting, which is really focused on human lifestyles, looking at human lifestyles that might occur in the future, thinking about those and then backcasting and interpreting what that might mean for different aspects of life. And Nivonen and others, they particularly focus on the role that infrastructure plays in this. So this is an area for me to really explore. So I wonder whether nature's lifestyle backcasting and human well-being or lifestyle backcasting are a way that we can actually bring nature and humankind together to have a conversation. It's not clear to me yet what the mechanism for that might be, but I do have a model that I would like to explore if I can find the voice of environment. And I saw that one of the earlier speakers over the course of the last few days has really focused on non-human actors and how they can participate with humans in discussions over various issues. And that's an area I'd like to explore as well. So I'm going to finish off with a model that humankind and nature might be able to use for negotiating infrastructure futures. So if we go right back to the beginning, we had Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we can see that appearing on the right. On the left, we have our capital stocks, and so we're really balancing between these two things, with infrastructure really as the piggy in the middle, which is intermediating between these two things. In some ways, infrastructure is a result of that discussion. So if we look at natural capital, and we can find a voice for natural capital in this equation, it might be possible for us to then find a way for us to be able to balance between the needs of nature and the environment on one hand through its own voice and the needs of humankind. And I say needs because really Maslow's hierarchy is a helpful way for us actually filtering between needs and wants. And a built hierarchy of needs is a way of us also being able to triage between those things that are most necessary in terms of the services that human requires going forward into our futures, and those things that are perhaps more superfluous. So this is a model that I'm working on, and I'm really looking forward to engaging in the conversation today, but also in future as the paper is published, and I then build on to the next step, which is really trying to understand the voice of nature. I'll pause there, but thank you, Paresh, and thanks again for asking me to speak.
Thanks, Richard. I mean, I've never seen this dimension of really thinking about the infrastructure. Carla, would you want to ask Richard anything?
No, in fact, I don't have questions. I would like to have a further reading of your work, in fact. Maybe considering there's only the three of us in the room, maybe I must say that I'm the editor-in-chief of Economia Creativa journal. That is the journal that is getting some of the works that the lecturers are presenting here. So I would like to extend you a formal invitation to publish your work in our journal. So I'd love to have a further reading of your work. If I can, yeah, tell me. So
that's very kind, Carla. Thank you. I'd like to have that discussion with you. Look, I've spent decades now as a practitioner, and this is a very good time in my career to be thinking more deeply about these issues. And much of it really came out of need through the earthquakes in Christchurch, and so being able to relate infrastructure to move beyond the physicality of infrastructure, to think about the services of infrastructure and the way that they relate to human needs, to make infrastructure human-centered was that step I took at that time 10 years ago. Now, to me, it's about infrastructure intermediating really between nature and humankind. So another level. And the missing piece really is around how we take a non-human actor into that negotiation. So the further work I'd like to explore, in addition to looking at these areas that have got their own legal personalities, there's a range of mechanisms for how we might be able to do that. And then to put it to the test in a hypothetical sense, but to put it to the test, really to challenge infrastructure strategists about new ways that we might be able to consider for thinking about infrastructure strategy, so that we can move away from these empirical approaches that are taking us on the same path that we've been on for the last 12,000 years. So it feels very uncomfortable to be breaking away from the cadre of infrastructure strategists that I've formed part of, to be looking at a new area. And so I really would welcome that conversation. Thanks for your comments.
Brilliant. Richard, could you go back a slide? I had this, so, in the human well-being futures, you mentioned lifestyle backcasting. So I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that while you were doing the Sohail's 6 pillars, right? When you were going through Sohail's pillars and everything, and so you may have come across the backcasting aspect or the element part of it. Anyways, I've been signed out of this account. Nevertheless, so I was wondering, the question is, what needs to happen? I mean, if this is something that you'd considered while you were working on this, what needs to happen if you were to sort of consider that humans will adapt to a different lifestyle, a more sustainable lifestyle?
Yes. So at the moment, I guess we have an assumption that that infrastructure, or our ability to be able to consume, is tempered by environmental legislation. And we can see that our model of living is based on having stuff. And so Nivonen's work is very interesting, because he's essentially saying, and part of the challenge is well-being is so hard to quantify. And so my paper spends a bit of time looking at different well-being quantification approaches, and concluding that this is a very difficult area. And so that's why I suggest that we might need to move towards more of a narrative form of interpreting lifestyle. And that could be down at an individual community level, or it could be globally. And so Nivonen's lifestyle backcasting is essentially saying, what are the alternatives? What are the range of possibilities for different lifestyles at different points in our futures? And how do we then interpret that and backcast? And that's a really attractive approach, because in doing that, we can then raise the example of a very constrained future, or a future of abundance. I think most of us would agree that the future of abundance is looking less likely than the future of constraints. But either way, it's possible then to take this approach and build the narrative, and then go, well, what does that mean for infrastructure? And then turn to nature and say, well, can we do that? And what are your needs? How do we meet those? How do we get that balance?
Great. Yeah, I mean, because I'm sort of, while you were presenting, I was sort of wondering, it took that unfortunate event in New Zealand for even you to actually move in this direction. And coming from Pakistan, it took like multiple things happening in this country for me to conclude, is there any level of futures thinking or foresight work happening in terms of the policy discourse, let alone the narrative part? And very quickly, I found out none of that has happened. But what I found quite interesting in your entire presentation, that if you were to make humans at the center of infrastructure strategic thinking or infrastructure development, and you come from a community where there's this still that old model of thinking, which has been going on for 12,000 years, how do you stand out? Like, or how do you negotiate? I mean, what's the negotiating space between this group that is dominant in terms of thinking about the infrastructure, and then there is you?
It's a really good question, Paresh. So before I went virtually full-time on the research, I was acting as the chief advisor to the chief executive of the Infrastructure Commission here in New Zealand, advocating very strongly for foresight and futures approaches and thinking about our strategy. But the weight of issues that New Zealand and other countries are facing on infrastructure right now means that strategy is much more short-term, and it's less possible to have those sort of longer-term discussions. So it's a really uncomfortable place because it's very easy to be written off as being something of a heretic and raising these issues, because people have got deadlines to meet, they've got masters to serve, and to be able to raise these areas that are fuzzy and don't lead to a solid outcome when a strategy is required at a particular time, and there are expectations about how it might look. That requires, I think, courage. And I think futurists in some ways have to be courageous, not in some ways, in all ways have to be courageous and accept that standing out is part of the deal. And that's something I've had to come to accept as well.
So, I mean, we were coming towards the end of your presentation and the Q&A, and I know I keep on going on. I did that with Professor Halal also. But what has your journey looked like in its entirety while you were doing this research work? How much of it was really daunting that you would have thought, like, what have I gotten myself into? And was there ever a point that you wanted to call it quits?
Yeah, the easy part for me would have been to stay at the World Bank and continue doing infrastructure in low and middle income countries. And that was a very comfortable path that was meaningful, and it was clear. So to step out into this really uncomfortable place, in some ways is that discussion between the ego and the soul. The ego is saying, yes, I like my salary. Yes, I like my house. Whereas the soul is saying, hold on, there's something much deeper bubbling in that really is existential for me. And I think that's the place I found myself in as well. So in some ways it was a personal journey of that type. And I guess every researcher has their own personal story, don't they?
I agree. And I'm sure Carla has much to add to this.
It's just
yeah, please go on.
It's just a very quick question, but I know it's complicated. How do you eliminate the bias, considering nature, it's a human concept as well? So when we are talking about negotiation between nature and humankind, both concepts are human. So how do you eliminate the bias, speaking about nature?
I don't know the answer, Carla, and it's a really good question because it requires some degree of interpretation. Unless our natural environment we're able to get up and speak, or we're able to listen in the right ways, then some degree of interpretation is required. And so I wonder whether a step down this path, even though it might carry bias with it, is a step in the right direction. I don't know the answer, and I'm certainly going to explore it because I think we'll have that question. People will say, "Who speaks for nature? What is that construct?" And in some ways, part of it is, who speaks for communities on their well-being as well. At the moment, we have nation states, governments speaking for their communities and determining infrastructure outcomes. And so we've got bias there as well. So I think there's bias everywhere. And I wonder whether part of the challenge is to find ways to have a model where there is bias initially, but that can be reduced over time.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I think, Carla, that was like the question that really hit the spot where, it got me thinking also, like, who really talks on behalf of nature?
Yeah.
Although my name in itself actually means nature. And then I can't be the one talking on behalf of nature. Yeah. But I see. Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. It really gave us the opportunity to really think about infrastructure and futures and how the two would come together. A great presentation. Carla, I just hand you over to, I see Alethea joining in, and it was great meeting you, great connecting with you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.